Hello everyone. Tonight we're going to continue our exploration of the wonders of the ancient world with a third monument, the Mausoleum at Halicarnassus. Please make yourself comfortable. This is going to be another dive into antique history. What is a mausoleum? Where is and what is this place, Halicarnassus? And why does it matter? We'll find out. The mausoleum at Halicarnassus was a tomb, a spectacular tomb, that was approximately 45 meters in height, that's 150 feet. You have to imagine a 12 to 15 story building, with each side richly decorated, especially with sculptures. It included about 400 freestanding sculptures. From its creation, this monument was immediately called an artistic and aesthetic triumph, so much so that the term mausoleum stayed. A mausoleum is used generally to name an above-ground tomb, a tomb of a certain size and with a certain level of decoration. The most famous mausoleum in the world today is probably the Taj Mahal in India, which has a distinctive, iconic architecture. And it is a mausoleum because the Taj Mahal is a tomb, or houses a tomb. The tomb of Mumtaz Mahal, the wife of an emperor, Shah Jahan. He commissioned this monument in the 17th century, and he is also buried in it. So this is what a mausoleum is, a fancy tomb or a building created specifically to house a tomb. Even though, generally, mausoleums are of more modest proportions than the Taj Mahal or the mausoleum we're going to discuss tonight. And the one at Halicarnassus is the tomb of a man called Mausolus. Mausoleum is a term that initially meant monument of Mausolus, before it became this generic term for that kind of monuments. Looking at history, we are not surprised when rulers of large kingdoms or empires get spectacular tombs, like for example Cheops, the pharaoh, and his pyramid, or the first emperor of China, Qin Shi Huang. But Mausolus was not such a historical figure. So who was he? And how did he get to have such an extravagant tomb without really being famous for anything else? To understand it, we need to delve into the history of this time and place. In the first millennium BC, there was a small kingdom, a state, mostly forgotten except by historians, in the west of Anatolia, the west of modern Turkey. A state called Caria. It was not the only one, and these small states of western Anatolia were strongly influenced by Greece. I alluded to it when I told you about Rhodes in the history of the Colossus of Rhodes. Western Anatolia was influenced and partly populated by Greek settlers, starting in the Iron Age by the end of the second millennium BC. Greek city-states and kingdoms saw Anatolia as foreign. What they called Asia began with Anatolia, on the other side of the Aegean Sea. for example, the city of Troy, against which the Greeks famously allied in the mythical story of the Trojan War, was in Anatolia. The regions of western Anatolia remained clearly distinct from Greece, starting with their languages, that were Anatolian languages. But Greek influence in this region was certain, especially along the coast of the Aegean Sea. Greek products and works of art arrived there. The Greek language was often taught to children of the elite, and it was also spoken by diplomats and merchants. And also all major Greek cities had relations, contacts with Anatolia. In the first half of the first millennium BC, a large kingdom emerged in West Anatolia, the kingdom of Lydia. The last king of Lydia was a man called Croesus. There is this term, rich as Croesus, for people who are extremely wealthy, and it alludes to him, even though we don't know for sure that he was that rich. In any case, if he was, it didn't save his throne, because in the 6th century BC, Lydia was conquered and annexed by the rising empire of the time, the Persians, the Achaemenid Empire. Persian or Achaemenid Empire is the same thing. Achaemenid is the name of the ruling dynasty of this empire. So the Persians became masters of Anatolia and stayed there for 200 years, until Alexander the Great would expel them in the 4th century BC. Persian rule had plenty of implications, starting with the creation of Persian provinces, also called satrapies. The kingdom of Lydia disappeared. There was a satrapy of Lydia, but it was much smaller. And this is how we circle back to Caria, the place where Mausolus would live. Caria was a satrapy of the Achaemenid Empire. At the head of such a province, there was a satrap, a kind of viceroy, that represented the emperor and ruled in the emperor's name. These satrapies paid a tribute to the emperor, and obviously they were supposed to always follow and support the policies of the empire. In practice, the satraps had a very large autonomy, especially in provinces that were far away from the heart of the Persian Empire. And even though the Persian Empire did not explode, it always kept its unity until Alexander the Great destroyed it. The satraps could do what they wanted, and many times they carved themselves an independent power base. And also because the satraps were viceroys, representatives of the true king, but close to kingship themselves, rather than employees or civil servants who could be named and replaced easily. They could abuse their power. The term satrap has remained mainly as a pejorative term for corrupt tyrants. Part of it because there were abuses, and also because the enemies of the Persians in this region of the world were the Greeks, and we are still culturally influenced by history as the Greeks saw it and wrote it, which included a degree of animosity or contempt for the Persian Empire. But from the 6th to the 4th centuries BC, the Persian Empire was there to stay in Anatolia and constantly threatened Greece, which it partially invaded. Most of the time, though, war was not raging, and the Persian arrival created this situation where Western Anatolia was culturally Anatolian, with a Greek influence, and politically Persian. This is the context in which the Mausoleum would be built. Among the satrapies established by the Persians, there was Caria, to the southwest of Anatolia, which was part of the Persian Empire, but it was really at its border, culturally very different, small and almost insignificant at the scale of the Persian Empire. And all this meant that it had a lot of autonomy. As long as the tribute was paid, the satraps of Caria would do what they wanted. And this is what Mausolus was, the master of Caria, who inherited this province from his father in 377 BC. He was at the same time a satrap and a hereditary ruler of Caria, because his family had long been a dynasty of local sovereigns. Mausolus was Anatolian. He was also an agent of the Persians, even though he had a high degree of independence, and because he was part of the local elite, his education had been for a large part Greek. He spoke Greek, knew classical Greek culture, he respected the art, the philosophy, the science that were born on the other side of the Aegean Sea. Mausolus was also expansionist on a small scale because he had limited military means and could not defy the Persian Empire, obviously, but he expanded his domain on the territory of Lycia, a region that was close to Caria. In Lycia, there was a tradition of the locals to build particular tombs for their rulers and their nobles. Tombs with a shape that would greatly inspire the Mausoleum. These tombs are called pillar tombs, and they consist of a large stone pillar. Imagine a large rectangle like a pedestal, above which a burial chamber was placed, an ornamented second level, inside which the body of the defunct was placed. So, technically, bodies were not buried under the monument. They were inside it and elevated above the ground level. There is a concentration of these tombs in a city called Xanthos. They are from the 6th to the 4th centuries, this time of Persian occupation and presence, and even though they were not in Greek territory, their style is one of the many aspects of this Greek influence in Anatolia. The style of their decoration was clearly Greek influenced. Mausolus had a sister, Artemisia, who would later become his wife. That sounds shocking, but at the time in antiquity, in ruling families, this was accepted as a practice to avoid the dilution of aristocratic blood or succession issues, even though incest was otherwise taboo in antique societies. So Mausolus and his sister ruled for 24 years, which was enough time for Mausolus to not only expand Caria, but also found cities, new cities, inspired by Greek urbanism along the coast, to promote Greek culture and aesthetic, and also develop a new capital, Halicarnassus. There is still a city where Halicarnassus was, Bodrum in Turkey. Apparently inspired by the Greek model, Mausolus embellished Halicarnassus in spectacular ways. Streets were paved, squares were drawn, the size of the city increased markedly with new housing, and a large fortified palace was built for Mausolus near the harbor. Mausolus and Artemisia also commissioned a theater, a temple to Ares, the god of war, and they had different public places improved with luxury materials like marble and statues. The same kind of aesthetic concern for art and ornamentation that would also influence the mausoleum. As part of all this building and improvement works in Halicarnassus, Mausolus also planned a tomb for himself. The size of the project looks a bit exaggerated for a satrap of the Persian Empire, even with an aristocratic Anatolian dynasty behind him. Most of the people in a similar position opted for much more modest tombs. But the reign of Mausolus had been relatively successful. He had expanded. There was no one to stop him, and so the project would become reality. But not while he lived. Mausolus died in 353 BC, after 24 years of reign. His exact age is uncertain, and the cause of death is unknown. And at this point, the tomb was only at an early stage of construction. It was continued by his surviving sister and wife, Artemisia, for 2 more years before she died herself. And after that, the tomb was completed after her death. The bodies were probably burnt, and urns with their ashes were placed in the tomb, which was unfinished at this point. We don't exactly know how advanced it was, but works went on after their death too. Their successors remained committed to this mausoleum, and eventually it was finished. So, what was it like? The building was rectangular, and in total, its height was close to 45 meters. The structure could be separated into 3 levels. At the base, there was a kind of large pillar, like a pedestal for the 2nd level, that contained the remains of Mausolus and Artemisia. This followed the structure of these Lycian tombs I mentioned before, in which the dead were not buried underground with a tombstone above them, but elevated above ground inside their tomb. Above this pillar was the tomb itself, surrounded with 36 columns. This part alone was about 11 meters or 37 feet high. And finally, to top this section, there was a pyramid above, a pyramid with 24 steps, 24 degrees, that ended with a platform on which the sculpture of a chariot was placed. And inside the chariot were the figures of Mausolus and Artemisia. These 3 levels reached this total height of more than 40 meters or 120 feet in total. The mausoleum was built on a hill, which made it look even higher, towering. This middle section looked a bit like a temple, and indeed various authors described it as a temple perched on this platform or this pillar. The building was also surrounded with a wall, forming a courtyard around it, so it was not directly accessible. It was possible to climb on top of the pillar and reach the second level, the one with the columns that looked like a temple, using a staircase flanked by stone lions. The monument had respectable dimensions, but what it really stood out for was the abundance and quality of its decoration. Statues were numerous, and all reflected the very realistic approach that characterized classical Greek sculpture, something that strongly impressed the Romans later, and that kept making antique classical Greek sculpture the benchmark or the fundamental reference in Western sculpture until the 20th century. Greek sculpture was very much focused on the human body, the human form. They also made animals and rarely objects, but humans, male and female, completely dominated the production of fine sculptures in Greece, especially in the classical period. Typically, art historians distinguish three main periods of ancient Greek monumental sculptures. There is an archaic one, from the 7th to the 5th centuries BC. Then there is a classical period, the 5th and 4th centuries BC, and after that, a Hellenistic period. After Alexander the Great, when Greek sculpture disseminated even more than before around the Eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East. In this Hellenistic period, there was no reduction in quality or abundance of the art production in general or of sculptures, but the styles mixed way more than before. In Egypt, in Central Asia, in India, in Persia or in Mesopotamia, the encounter of Greek and local traditions opened a period of experimentation and mixing of styles and influences. In contrast, the classical period, as the name suggests, is considered the purest form of these Greek standards and canons. Now, even after the classical period, Greece itself continued to produce sculptures that are undistinguishable from the ones of the classical period, except by experts of that field. But outside Greece, there was a much more diverse Greek-inspired production of sculptures. Now, at the time of the construction of the Mausoleum, we are in the 4th century BC, several decades before Alexander the Great, during the classical period. And the Mausoleum was an extraordinary display of these Greek classical sculptures, and bas-relief too, that had been commissioned to some of the most famous Greek sculptors of the time. So, even though we were not in Greece, and actually in a satrapy of the Persian Empire, this was still a celebration of Greek art as Mausolus intended. That's also the reason why the Greeks would later praise the Mausoleum so much and include it in the list of wonders of the world. Following the Greek tradition, The emphasis of this collection of sculptures that ornamented the mausoleum was on the representation of people. Why this concern of Greek sculptors for the perfect representation of humans, from their faces or their hands to the draperies of their clothes? At the start, because the Greek artistic tradition regarded the human form as the most important subject for artistic expression. Nothing was more interesting or elevated than the human form, and they saw it as divine too. The gods and goddesses were seen as having human form themselves. This meant that there was no big difference in treatment between the sacred and the secular in art. A statue of Zeus, Poseidon, or Athena would not really be treated differently from one of a king or an Olympic champion. Regular humans were represented in a realistic style, but they were also idealized. Always muscular and ripped for men, curvy for women, and obviously average people did not look that good according to Greek beauty standards, but still the proportions, the treatment of shapes, it was all very realistic. Greek religion also used a lot of sculpture, starting with an effigy of the divinity worshipped in every temple, a statue of the god or the goddess that was placed in the naos, the inner chamber of the temple, and that was accessible to be seen by the public, at least on some occasions. So, in artistic representations, this lack of separation or this ambiguity between what was secular and what was sacred meant that these big life-size or bigger than life-size statues had an aura that must have been much more impressive to the Greeks than what we can perceive today. On top of being a little sacred, these perfectly realistic sculptures were a striking vision in these ancient societies that were not overloaded with images and representations as we are today. We barely have time for paintings and pictures in general, or even for statues, because we live in an abundance of representations. There are billboards, large and small screens, statues in public places, mannequins in stores. We are bombarded every day with 2D and 3D representations of humans of all styles, from realistic to cartoonish. It is every day, it is constant, and we barely see them anymore. In antiquity, there was nothing of this, and representations of the human form were much more out of the ordinary, attractive than they are now. So, a place, a single monument, with 400 statues, that was almost unique, literally amazing for visitors. This site created a kind of immersion, of break with everyday life, that could maybe only be compared with what we experience entering an over-the-top palace or a large cathedral or a theme park. We know these things are created by humans, but they are literally out of the ordinary. Hence this fascination with the mausoleum that we could have a hard time understanding today. Whatever side you looked at, there were these slightly bigger than life-size realistic statues of figures, we don't know exactly of whom. There were probably heroes, gods, and important historical figures, including Mausolus and Artemisia. They were represented at least once on top of the monument in their chariot and its 4 horses. We know a bit more about the bas-reliefs that were abundant all around the second level behind the columns that surrounded it. These represented mythological scenes, such as the Centauromachy, a mythical fight that broke out between centaurs and humans during a wedding, or an Amazonomachy, a combat between Greeks and Amazons, these fierce female warriors of mythology. And so it didn't take long before the mausoleum became famous, well beyond the frontiers of Caria. Its impressive dimensions and ornamentation reached all of Greece, and 10 years later, when Alexander the Great arrived, it was still intact. Anatolia changed hands as the Persian Empire was crumbling, and Halicarnassus lost its status of capital of a satrapy. In the following centuries, the city declined and finally turned to ruins. Bodrum would develop only later. The mausoleum was on its hill, slowly deteriorating. Until the Middle Ages, it stayed like this, above the remains of Halicarnassus, for about 16 centuries. But finally, a series of earthquakes and the lack of maintenance caused its destruction. By the years 1400 AD, it seems only the base, the platform, was still recognizable. The chariot on top had fallen, and the pyramid and the level with columns, the temple, had collapsed too, turning into a pile of rock. The remains of Mausolus and Artemisia were never found. This is not necessarily surprising, because the most likely is that they were cremated, and that only urns with their ashes were placed inside the monument. No bodies were ever discovered on the site anyway, but it appeared that at some point in antiquity or after, looters had dug a tunnel inside the pillar leading to the chamber where the ashes, or maybe the bodies, had been placed. So if there was any remain or treasure there, it had long gone when the monument finally collapsed. As it had turned to a pile of rocks that was barely recognizable, the stones were used to build a fortress in Bodrum, a fortress of the Knights of Rhodes. I told you about them in the episodes about the Crusades and the Colossus of Rhodes too. This fortress was taken by the Ottomans as they expelled the knights from their bastions, which became Ottoman bastions, whereas Bodrum turned into a Turkish city, which it still is 500 years later. So the mausoleum actually survived a long time after its construction. Thanks to it, Mausolus could have his name stay in history, which it would barely have if he had just been the satrap of Caria for 20 years. The exact site of the mausoleum was forgotten until its rediscovery in the 19th century. And with excavations, many statues, bas-relief, even one of the bronze wheels of the chariot on top, were found. This wheel was 2 meters more than 6 feet in diameter. That gives an idea of the size of this chariot that was once placed more than 120 feet above ground. Finally, the statues of Mausolus and Artemisia that once stood on the chariot were found. In the 20th century, the site was studied more thoroughly, confirming the extraordinary wealth of sculpture and the wonderful monument that the mausoleum once had been. We have reached the end of tonight's story. It is now time for you to let go and fall asleep. But if you are not sleepy yet, you can pick another episode from my library. I'll be back soon with a new one. And next time we will explore a fourth wonder of the ancient world, the statue of Zeus at Olympia. In the meantime, sleep well, sweet dreams, au revoir.